like that. Thank you all. Get this generational pride thing going, you know. Identity politics. It's great to talk to you. It's great to talk to you all this afternoon. You know, when I talk to a group about generations, the first reaction I sometimes get is intimidation, because it's this huge abstract social science concept. People find it hard to put their hand around it. So the first thing I like to do to make it a little bit more concrete, personal, is I have a number of cartoons. I'm going to show one right now, so you can advance it here. 3 sets of high school sweethearts in 3 different decades, right? And the point of this cartoon is to bring one point home to all of you, and that is your generational location in life strongly shapes how you view life. That doesn't mean you necessarily had one of these conversations, and I'm not going to get a show of hands in here. But I think you all can appreciate how each of these images says something very important about the youth mood of the time. Think about the early 1950s, mid-1950s. What was the most important thing that young people had on their minds of doing? Fitting in, high social expectations, social standards, and making long-term decisions at a very young age. And then think about 20 years later, how everything changed. Now is about breaking rules, flouting convention, defying authority, taking voyages inside yourself. And then think about 20 years even later. Suddenly the youth mood changed again. Now it was all about surviving, taking care of yourself in a world, a dangerous world, where the rules no longer seem to protect young people anymore. And the more you reflect on this, the more you realize is that the way these generations are shaped is going to influence everything about how they behave. The messages they respond to, the products they buy, the candidates they vote for, the kinds of work they're going to choose, the kind of careers they're going to choose. And what's really interesting about this is that not only does it help you understand who these generations are, but it actually allows you to make predictions by looking along what I call the generational diagonal. You know, if you have age on one axis and time on the other, we all live on a diagonal, right? We all live different diagonals. And if you want to know where we're going on that diagonal, keep in mind those diagonals are just the same people, changing each phase of life as they move through it. So consider, for instance, let's just give an example. So I'm sure many of you have had need to do this. Financial services, let's take that as an example. So you have this couple here, maybe in their late teens in the 1950s. What kind of financial service advice do you think they would want to consume by the time they get into their 40s? Well, I mean, think about them. They're over-socialized kids. So it's going to be highly expert, highly professional, genteel, sophisticated, right? I mean, you can just tell from the kinds of kids they are. Maybe it'll be something like this, and I'm sure a lot of you recall this show. It was the most popular financial advisory show on TV throughout much of the 80s and early 90s. Anyone recall this show? Louis Rukeyser, Wall Street Recon Review. And they had, Louis came out, there's a member of the silent generation, and he came out with these Shakespearean limericks. Do you remember that? Polysyllabic little quips. And everyone was served on these very elegantly appointed sofas, and there was tea served, and they would all discuss, the various social forces that were impacting the world and so forth, and they would, have a decorous conversation. All right. Now let's make another prediction. See this group in the 1990s coming of age. How do you think they would want to consume financial services by the time they reach their 40s? Maybe something a little more survivalist, something more pragmatic, hard scrabble, with attitude, in your face. Maybe you could have predicted it'd be a show like this. Jim Cramer's Mad Money. It's very simple. Watch TV, get rich. And there's Jim Cramer picking things up in the studio and throwing things around. Do you see my point? If you understand who a generation is, you understand all kinds of things that are going to come along the way as they grow older. All right. Well, what is a generation? A generation is a group of people born over about 20 years or so, about the length of a phase of life, between being born and coming of age as an adult. And we locate generations by looking for groups that share certain attitudes and behaviors in common. That's criteria number one. The second is they have a certain collective identity that they're aware of. You know, we even talk about my generation, your generation. We give each generation names. So it's not a completely unconscious social fact. It's something we're aware of. And secondly, and I should say thirdly, a generation occupies a distinct location in history. Remember, if you belong to a generation, you have an attachment to a distinct era of history in your childhood and a distinct subsequent era coming of age into adulthood. So to see how this works, let me take a look at some of our recent generations, which we defined slightly differently than the Census Bureau, particularly the Boomer generation. We moved them back a few years. But this is their location in history. And let's just look at these generations for a second. The GI generation, which literally means government issue or general issue, is stenciled on their backpacks when they went off to World War II. We all know who this generation is, right? They came of age with the Great Depression, the New Deal, World War II. Tom Brokaw wrote a book about them, the greatest generation. I think that's how we all perceive them. We all live in the civic shadow of this generation. The silent generation has a different location in history. They were the children of the Great Depression, World War II, and they came of age during the American High, the presidencies of Truman and Eisenhower and John Kennedy. The boomers, by definition, have no memory of World War II. They were the children of the American High, and they came of age during that period of rapid social and cultural change we sometimes call the consciousness revolution. Boomers like to think they reinvented the culture. They gave new meaning to everything they touched. It's an interesting joke by Senator John McCain. He said, yeah, something about those boomers. Everything they touch becomes more meaningful but less effective, you know, but anyway. And then you have the Generation X. Generation X has no memory of the American High. In fact, a good test of an Xer is, do you personally recall John Kennedy's assassination? A boomer does, even very early in life. An Xer doesn't. Another good test might be, do you remember Jim, Jimmy, or Janice when they were still alive? I mean, I can think of a lot of other tests too, but this really makes a difference. These were little kids of Woodstock. And they grew up when the culture and society and families were being turned upside down. And they really started coming of age in the early Reagan years. Very different location in history. And now we have a millennial generation, which yet has another location in history. They don't remember the consciousness revolution even as children. Woodstock is an SOL question on their exams. It's as distant from them as the New Deal is for a boomer like myself. And of course, they're coming of age at a time of much more public upheaval, both in terms of the wars we're fighting and obviously what's happening to the economy. So that's a look. And what I'm going to do now is take you through some stories of each of these generations. And as we go, look at what we foresee changing, particularly for younger generations, as they enter their next phase of life. And finally, to suggest some of the broader patterns of history that we actually see, because these different kinds of generations don't follow each other at random. There's actually a pattern in which they follow each other, which is actually highly connected to a very important pattern in the course of history itself. All right. Let's first take a look at the GI generation. We all know their huge achievements. We know about everything they built, the wars they won, the post-war Pax Americana, everything from Bretton Woods to the UN. This generation poured more concrete than other generations. All the rivers they straightened and harbors they built. They built all these things, but one question we rarely ask is, who built them? Where did they come from? And it's kind of an interesting question, isn't it? The answer, and we've written about this a lot in various books we've written, is the GIs as little kids in the first couple of decades of the 20th century were little kids who were fussed over by protective parents and communities who wanted to raise up kids as good as the previous generation, which later became known as the lost generation, was horrible. I mean, you know, high rates of juvenile delinquency, crime, suicide, drug use. Drugs were completely unregulated back then. I'm sure you're aware that in 1900, Coca-Cola had the real thing, right? Well, we had the Harrison Drug Act, to keep kids away from that. We had prohibition to keep alcohol away from kids. We had all kinds of stuff, child labor laws. We had, for the first time in American history, older people wanted to see kids dressed in uniforms. So we invented, right around 1910, 1915, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Campfire Girls, 4-H clubs. These were the first Miss Americas in the early 1920s. And they gave America a new sense of optimism, a new ethic of cooperation on college campuses by the late 1920s. And come the Great Depression, this generation responded by voting by overwhelming majorities, 85% majorities, for the party of community and big government, right? Democratic Party and the New Deal, 1932, 1936, was the first generation of African Americans to vote for the Democratic Party, no longer the Republican Party. These were the CCC dam builders and tree planters during the Great Depression. During World War II, they were the most uniformed generation per capita in American history. And when they came home from the war, they just kept on building. Interstate highways, suburbs, miracle vaccines. Later on as presidents, it was model cities, the Great Society, trips to the moon. Again, a Promethean builder generation. And they got into huge arguments with their boomer kids after the war, didn't they? Boomers who didn't understand the moral purpose of always making institutions bigger and stronger all the time. And so by the time GI started retiring, and this would have been, well, you just count the years, this would have been in the mid-1960s, their idea of retirement was to get away from their kids in these big cities in the middle of the desert, right? Sun City, Leisure World, with age-restricted covenants that prevented young people from moving anywhere near them so they could listen to their Benny Goodman music. And it's interesting, that's, well, when they were young, older people thought of them as junior citizens. You remember those WPA murals with these young people doing these big heroic things? Junior citizens. But when they reached age 65, right around the late 1960s, we invented a new word to describe old people. Senior citizens. We'd never described people. We never called old people senior citizens until this generation entered past age 65. We just called them old people. That was good enough. And interestingly, that was part of a new image of what it meant to be an older person. Of course, they all belonged to unions, and when they reached age 65, they all joined AARP. You know what I mean? It was just sort of one big membership organization to another. Anyway, that's the story of their generation. It's been fascinating. It's made a huge imprint on boomers. Let's move on to the next. Say a few words about the silent generation. The silent started off as the children of crisis. The style of child rearing, which is becoming more protective for the GIs, approached the point of suffocation. Well, there was a war going on. There was a depression going on. Things, you didn't want dangerous things to happen to kids. We think of them as little rascals, in the old movies, Shirley Temple. And when the silent began coming of age, just after World War II, they surprised everyone. And that's what you need to remember. Every generation comes of age as a surprise. What was the surprise? Well, you interviewed kids in the late 40s on college campuses, and unlike the GI generation, they didn't want to, they weren't joining the Communist Party, radically aggressive new ways of using government. They didn't want to conquer half the world and so on. Their motto was, we don't want to change the system, we want to work within the system. Fortune magazine had a cover story called The College Class of 49, and the subtitle was, Taking No Chances. On job interviews, their first questions were about pension plans, right? And they got those 30-year invisible handshakes with their employers with a defined benefit pension plan at the end of it, right? And guess what? This generation's the only generation that's ending up receiving those defined benefit pension plans. It's all unraveling for younger generations. But, they made a deal, they lived up to it, and they actually got it. They also got married and had kids, younger on average than any other generation in American history. A lot of early conformity in this generation. I will say quickly that that's had a lot of stress in the personal lives of this generation. Later on, by the 60s and 70s, you saw younger people enjoying all kinds of freedom, and that ultimately led to the divorce revolution. This is the generation that spearheaded the divorce revolution in the late 60s and 70s, often when their Gen X kids were around. And so somewhat awkwardness about in their personal lives. But in their economic lives, this generation has done very well. Richard Easterlin, the demographer, calls this the lucky generation or the fortunate generation because, well, you remember Woody Allen here, you remember what he used to say, 80% of life was just showing up. They didn't have to wait for the war to end, unlike the GIs. Young people were paid relatively high wages in the late 50s and early 60s. They locked into 4.5% mortgages in the late 60s just before inflation hit. So a lot of them paid 10, 15 years of negative interest rates on their homes. And just as soon as they started really beginning to save for their retirement, when they were hitting midlife in the early 1980s, we experienced the biggest financial boom in American history, both in stocks and bonds. So they rode that boom up. And guess when the last cohort of the silent generation retired? You can just do your arithmetic here. They reached age 65 in 2007. Now that is timing, come on. But this whole business of 80% of life is just showing up. I ask Xers that question, and they don't even get the joke. They just think it's a sick joke. You gotta be kidding. Showing up, not in my world, you know what I mean? So this is very interesting. And we see this in the data, by the way. I work closely with the Fed, the St. Louis Fed. We had a big conference in DC just a couple months ago. And we actually looked at a lot of very interesting data on real median family net worth. For the first time in American history, age 75 plus has the highest median net worth. Take a look at these trends. You can see how well the silent generation is doing on average. And Gen Xers, you can see the bad news for you guys, right? That's the trend in your age bracket right now. And that's how you compare with earlier decades versus how older people compare with earlier decades. The silent generation is, by the way, ARP polls show that the term senior citizen is falling into disuse with people in their 70s, early 80s. It doesn't fit them. It doesn't feel right. All that civic quality. This generation didn't splash ashore in Normandy. They didn't invent the A-bomb. We need to invent a new word for this new generation of young elders, young retirees. I'm not as going to be. It's not going to be senior citizens. It's going to be something nicer like senior partner. How's that? Old bopper. Granddaddy-o, something, just a different expression. Okay, let's move. And I will say one other thing about the silent. They are hugely sought after in the workplace today. I don't know if you see Home Depot and CVS, they love this generation because they're so good with people. That's the thing about it being over-socialized. Everyone likes you. And so, they hire them, they fill out all the forms in triplicate, they actually call in when they're sick. And they're wonderful with customers. Who makes the best telemarketers today? The silent generation. They're so nice you can't hang up on them. Who is Walmart? Get to be their greeters. You don't get a Gen Xer to be your greeter. It's not going to work for you. Anyway, so you can see how we use these strengths, these generational strengths, and people are subconsciously aware of them. Okay, boomers. We all know the boomer life story. It's as though no phase of life means anything until boomers have experienced it and can tell other generations all about it, right? That's how it works. These were the feed-on-demand Dr. Spock babies just after World War II, the indulged beaver cleavers of the 50s, the long-haired radicals and Vietnam grunts and screaming inner-city rioters of the 1960s. They became known as professionals in the early 80s, and we actually invented the word yuppie to describe them, right? The yuppie, the rise of the yuppies. A very perfectionist, self-directed professional with carving kind of a new definition of what it meant to be a careerist. Two big trends, I think, are important to keep in mind when thinking about boomers. The first trend is, and this is what the demographer Cheryl Mercer calls the master trait of boomers, and that is their individualism. It's defined their entire life. their self-sufficiency. They don't need anyone. They don't need other institutions. That's why they opted out of those defined benefit pension plans. They don't need anyone else looking after them. Think about it. This is the first generation of women to be essentially economically independent. I mean, that alone is revolutionary. Robert Putnam, the famous Harvard sociologist, wrote a book not long ago called Bowling Alone. And he asked the question, why do Americans do things alone that we used to do in groups? Like going bowling, you know, we used to go with the Oaks Club or the Kiwanis Club. And now we just go bowling alone. Well, the book is this long, you probably don't want to read it, so let me sum it up in a sentence. He looks at all the data and he says that the reason the shift in everything, politics, commerce, everything, to doing things alone has been just generational. It's been generational aging. The silent and GIs were used to train to do things more in terms of groups, sociable groups, are aging out. Boomers and obviously Xers after them were socialized to do things alone, by themselves, and they're replacing them. The other big trend I think that everyone recognizes about boomers is their moralism, their values orientation. Boomers are a generation that's just fixated on issues of right versus wrong, good versus bad, true versus false. And they've always taken these perceptions and tried to reshape the culture with them. Back in the late 60s, they were proud of their, what we call counterculture, Consciousness 3, greening of America, kind of their art and their music, everything was completely alien from older people. And today, now that once they hit their 50s and now into their 60s, it's no longer counterculture, it's culture wars, right? Blue zone versus red zone. You want to see the kind of media the news that boomers love to watch. It's Fox News and MSNBC. You want to watch two news shows that you will never see a millennial watching, Fox News, MSNBC. You know, guys in their 50s and 60s are ripping into each other. You know, the boomers love that. It's a blood sport. And by the way, I live in D.C., and that's why absolutely nothing happens in Washington, D.C. anymore. It's because boomers are the senior leaders, and they are all no prisoners warfare with each other. And we saw the House change in the early 90s when boomers took over in 1994. We saw the Senate change in the late 90s, and now it's institutional. So taking a look at boomers, and just a few things about boomers, let me just mention, because I think I probably have a few stray remarks here. We see this in the commercial culture. There's actually a friend of mine, Roy Spence, he used to be head of GSDM. He coined the phrase, don't mess with Texas and all these things. And he's a typical boomer. It's not what you sell, it's what you stand for. Why every extraordinary business is driven by purpose. I mean, how boomer is that? I'm sure you all know Rick Warren, is a great boomer evangelical, and he sold zillions of copies of Purpose-Driven Life. I mean, who brought this serious notion that everything in life has to be lofty and purposeful? What about this? Boomers are the most workaholic generation today, by their own admission, and we've done lots of studies of this. And they're the generation that, they come in on Monday morning and they tell everyone, make everyone feel bad by saying, I worked 90 hours last week. Till some Gen Xer in the back of the room says under their breath, yeah, but what did you actually get done? That's a different question. Right? And then we see it with the rise of the experience economy. It's a great book by Joe Pines. How do you turn a 5-cent cup of coffee into a $3.50 product? Well, you make an experience, right? That's what Starbucks done. So this is something the boomers have done with their quest for meaning. You don't sell a boomer a briefcase, you sell them a briefcase experience. And I think particularly you see at the high end where the high profit margins are, this has truly reshaped our economy. Where are boomers going now that they are beginning to reshape the senior phase of life? Well, this is what we see. First of all, they're going to transform elderhood, as we call it. First thing that they're going to do is we're going to see a complete end of what we call traditional retirement. Boomers don't even like the word retirement. There's a lot of boomers say, what does that mean? I'm dead? Does that mean I go have to die somewhere? But what's interesting about boomers is you think about their GIs who raised them. Retired much earlier, as early as they could, wanted to be away from their kids, and they wanted to be with and very close to their own peers. In every respect, boomers are retiring in the opposite way. First of all, as workaholics. They do not want to get away from their work. And in fact, we've seen since the Great Depression, 60-plus Americans are the only age bracket which has been continuously adding jobs throughout the entire Depression. The entire Depression was under age 60. And in fact, they still haven't reached the job count they were when the Depression began. So that's the first thing. They're working longer. They're still working as hard as they can. Sometimes out of a sense of mission, sometimes out of a sense of necessity. They didn't save as well. The second thing is that they are not trying to be away from their family. We have seen a huge renaissance in the extended family in America, which is being ushered in by boomers. And we see even entire brands now of homes, which are building homes for extended families and transforming those McMansions often. You know, these millennials, they come home and they don't leave, right? I mean, you know, what are you going to do? And then finally, they don't want to live near their peers. In fact, this would be an ideal boomer home, right? No neighbors. And there's only one of them. And it's exquisitely antique, and no one can ever make another one like it. So not exactly a suburban, not exactly Levittown, is it? What else? Rising inequality, personal risk-taking. We see inequality hugely growing as we go from first-wave boomers to last, and the whole generation is beginning to do a little bit less well. And this has a number of themes. First of all, it means that the high end, there will continue to be a big high end, but a lot of this generation will be doing a lot worse. They're retiring early on disability insurance, particularly those who don't have college education. We predict that 10 years from now, there will be a much weaker middle class for boomers over age 60. Everything's either going to be restoration hardware or dollar store. There's going to be nothing in between. So. And finally, we see increasing risk-taking among older people as boomers move into these age brackets. They're the same generation. They're taking the same risks. They're just getting older now. The STD rates are skyrocketing. The biggest opioid problem now is that people around age 50. Motorcycles, my God. Motorcycle deaths over age 50 now exceed those under age 30. Back in the 1970s, it was 10 to 1 under age 30 to over age 50. Can't get them off their Harleys. Suicide, obesity, the share who think that their health is not as in good a shape. So there's another aspect. And finally, rising cultural influence. This is something that's completely the opposite of the GI generation. The GI generation was civically powerful, but culturally weak. Boomers, the opposite. They're culturally powerful, but civically weak. We've seen this pattern repeatedly in American history, and this is no exception. So even in their 80s, boomers are still going to be writing all the op-ed pieces in the newspaper. They're still going to be screaming at each other on talk radio. It's not going to be a pretty picture. And they're still going to be playing those 1,200 golden oldies until the last boomer dies. At which point, Gen Xers is going to have a bonfire of celebration. Isn't it amazing, though? If you've seen even in Super Bowl halftimes, who do they bring out in the last 15 years? You know, Tom Petty, The Who, Paul McCartney, Madonna. I could just go down. All these boomers, some of these guys are pushing 70. And what's amazing is millennials love them. It's like, my God, that's real classic culture. I think I'm going to take the summer off and learn Led Zeppelin riffs or something. You know. But it's interesting. Very different. A complete closing of the generation gap in the culture. And we're going to get back to that in just a second when we talk about millennials. Boomers are less worried about how much money they're going to leave their kids. They're worried about the values they leave their kids. This is something that U.S. Trust has shown in their own surveys. What is money going to do for these kids if they don't have values? Again, boomers are obsessed on this. The GI generation, they basically said, I hate my kids, but I'm going to leave them the money and to hell with them, you know? Boomers, it's very different. Okay. And finally, all of these fringe things back in the 70s, everything from organic foods to nutraceuticals and yoga and all this stuff, they've all become 10, 20, $30 billion industries. Again, talking about the dominance of boomer culture. Okay, now let's look a little bit at Generation X. X is an interesting word for a generation, isn't it? It's kind of an identity hiding label. It's like, what's behind the X? And the first thing you know about Xers, the first thing I learned about Xers is they don't think they belong to any generation. There's just a lot of bits and pieces, a lot of individuals. And you think about it, first of all, they are the most spread out in terms of income and wealth of any generation today. No middle class. They have the largest percentage of immigrants of any generation today. Huge, lots of young people migrated here in the 80s and 90s. So they don't have much sense of commonality. And I think that lack of commonality is what also is interesting, explaining why Gen Xers are so impelled by risk, and they feel so comfortable in risk-taking. So it's an important part of Xer culture. The rules are I'm not going to give you success. I have to take risks to succeed. It's not like the silent generation. If I follow the rules, I got to take risks, and if they don't work, I just have to get back on my feet and take another risk. And so the idea is not to identify with other people my age, because most of them aren't going to make it. And that's what this generation is told when they came along. It's like a giant traffic accident. You don't want to be part of it. When Xers first came to DC, in a book we wrote about them back in 1993, they came with Bill Clinton. A lot of their young staffers were Generation X. I went down and interviewed them. I said, tell me about your generation. Tell me about your generation. And half of them said something like, I don't belong to that generation. I come from a good family. I mean, that was the image. That was the image of Gen X. And it's interesting. In our own work, we sometimes call them America's 13th generation. They're literally the 13th in a row since the first US generation of Sam Adams and Benjamin Franklin. We sometimes also call them a generation wearing shades. Whenever a boomer comes up to ask one of those principled, probing, philosophical questions, they can put on those reflecting Ray-Bans, right? That way the Xer gets to keep his privacy, the boomer can look at himself, that makes everyone happy. So you can see how that works. But seriously, the number 13 also conjures up some of the bad luck and ill timing of their life cycle. Think about it. Child rearing is becoming more indulgent for boomers, but by the time Xers came along, it was complete complete lack of structure, right? It was complete hands-off child rearing. In the early 1960s, the divorce rate began to accelerate. Schools no longer seemed to work. After 1962, the birth rate plummeted, and this generation became known at the time as a baby bust generation. Why? Because no one wanted to have them. They were considered a bother at that time. It was the consciousness revolution. People wanted to discover themselves. They didn't want to have kids. The lowest fertility rate in American history, 2 years after Watergate, 1976, 1.6 children per woman per lifetime, and hugely recovered after that. One way I like to illustrate the hostility to children when Xers came along, sort of looking at the sort of the opposite kind of from the silent generation, is something that may have occurred from you from time to time. You ever thought about this? A brief chronology of the Evil Child movie era. I ask you to reflect on this because this was the most popular genre of Hollywood movie for 20 years. They all had spin-offs and sequels. You could not help but pack a movie theater with a demonic image of children. And when they weren't devouring older people, they were annoyances. You remember Kramer versus Kramer? You remember Willy Wonka? These were horrible kids. Do you remember Tatum O'Neal and Paper Moon? These were tough kids, cynical, hard kids. You didn't want to hug these kids. And there was a point to that, because at a time when older people were finding themselves, it was thought the best way to raise kids was to have them raise themselves. Give them a latchkey guide, give them a self-care guide, have them read Judy Blume. They'll be happy to live in your house after reading that. But you see, it's interesting that I can go in a classroom now with maybe freshman and sophomore and talk to millennials, and I can talk about latchkey kids, and they'll stare at me blankly. They have no idea what I'm talking about. Every Xer that I've ever talked about knows what a latchkey kid is, and that's how generations matter, because these things hit some generations, they don't hit others. And when Xers began to grow a little bit older, they began to see how the world really worked. This is an interesting survey that's been taken since the late 1960s. What do you think is most important? It's taken thousands of freshmen across the country. Well, you can see back when boomers were freshmen, look at the late 60s, right? Meaningful philosophy of life is like 3 to 1 more important than being financially well. Look how that changed when Xers came into college. It's interesting, a 3 to 1 political landslide or a political switch, you almost never see anything that seismic. But in generations, we sometimes just don't notice because it happens a little bit more slowly. What do we see in this generation? You know, these believers in resilience, this anti-fragile generation, this generation of free agents who take pride in their ability to, one by one, to take everything that life offers them. One thing we've seen is a huge change in commercial messages. You don't sell lifestyle anymore. You sell save me time, save me money, save me trouble, otherwise get out of my face, right? I mean, that's the attitude of a Gen Xer. And I love these ads, everything from Just Do It to No Middleman. And I think my favorite recent one is the Chili's ad. Get in, get out, get on with your life. You know what I mean? You know, what could be simpler than that? And this, of course, is the new workplace for the Gen Xer. I love these ads. This is Advanced Auto Parts, where just to show that their workers deliver their mufflers quickly to your car, they train them by strapping slabs of beef and having lions chase them, right? And hey, if we lose a few, that's okay, right? They're expendable. Okay, how Gen Xers will transform midlife? First of all, they are defining what I call the new frugality, and I've written several pieces on that. This is the generation who's by far the worst hit by the Great Recession. They were the ones who bought into the stock market late. They bought into the real estate market late. They bought into real estate in ex-urban locations where price dropped the most. They're the most likely to be underwater on their mortgages today. This is a generation that's truly struggling. Much higher debt levels at the same phase of life than boomers or silent at the same age. They're also a generation we're beginning to realize falling behind other older cohorts. If you look at, again, this is Fed data. We're really beginning to piece a much better picture now of how this looks. You can see they represent the end of the American dream in terms of rising living standards when you look at these cohorts. They're beginning to fall behind older generations at the same age. The other thing is sheltered kids, close family. One of the most fascinating things about Gen Xers is despite the fact that they're raised in a hands-off way, they are all over their kids. We've seen this before in our history, but these are absolutely hands-on kids. And one of the reasons why they're retreating from the labor force to some extent is that they're spending more time with their kids, especially the fathers. And we see this. Let's see if I can just show this. Attachment parenting, William and Martha Sears, came out in 1992, 1994, just when Xers are beginning to have kids, and it has hugely influenced the way these parents raise their kids. Totally hands-on for as long as you can. And finally, this generation, you see a fall in social trust and a rise in personal empowerment. You market to this generation, you assume they don't trust you. You just start out with the assumption that what you're selling makes no sense at all, and then you sort of build on that from nothing. The other thing you see is that if you want to connect with this generation, give them ownership, give them power. I've been amazed recently by my Macy's, my Food Lion, my Safeway prices, personalized pricing for me. I am FedEx.com. I have no idea what that means, but it sounds like they're giving me ownership. You know what I mean? Prudential used to say, invest in us, we're as strong as the rock in Gibraltar. They went after Xers, they started saying, own a piece of the rock. I mean, you get the difference? That's how you're going after Xers now. All right. Then millennials came along. Now, what about millennials? We think millennials came along in the early 1980s, and something interesting was happening in our country. We had that huge period of social and family experimentation, and right around the late 70s, early 80s, right around 1980, we had this kind of break, a peaking of kind of a peak point in our culture for the divorce rate, the abortion rate, alcohol consumption per capita, and many forms of recreational drug use peaked right around 80, 81, and then since have all gradually been falling. This is the end of what Francis Fukuyama calls the Great Disruption, and it really does mark a a boundary line historically in terms of historical periods. Right after that point, millennials appeared amidst the Reagan era, a lot of talk about family values, cocooning, and all these yuppies taking pride in their new kids. And that year in 1982, we saw a new bumper sticker on cars all across America. Do you remember this? Baby on board. And it was affixed to a new kind of vehicle, the family-oriented minivan. 15 different ways of buckling that precious cargo into their seats. Back when Gen Xers were kids, you just told kids to do this, you know. That was good enough. You remember those childless devil horror movies? They suddenly bombed at the box office. No one wanted to see them anymore. Instead, it was cuddly baby movies. It was Parenthood and Baby Boom and 3 Men and a Baby, all those John Travolta talking baby movies. And by the early 1990s, different kind of movie about adolescent kids. Soccer moms with adolescent kids who inspired them to become better people. I don't know if you remember these movies like Angels in the Outfield, Sleepless in Seattle. Today, probably our biggest client is Viacom, so we work a lot with media companies. And the people who run films out of Paramount tell me that the ideal plot line for a movie today is millennial kid puts exer dad into rehab. I mean, that's a great plot line. But anyway, a very different sense of who these kids are. What else has changed? Well, in the 1980s, we suddenly saw a multi-billion-dollar industry of safety devices, right? Devices you put on your plugs, your car, your stove, your bicycle helmets. Back in the late 70s, you just did that with rubber bands and cellophane. There were no products. Fathers present at the birth of their children. In the late 1970s, 20% present at the birth of their kids. In the late 1980s, thanks to the Lamaze movement, 65%. Today, by the way, it's about 80%. Huge changes. By the time these kids started going to school in the early 1990s, we suddenly had boomer presidents. You know, we had Bill Clinton and then George W. Bush, and we had the huge unraveling of culture wars in America. What are most of the boomer culture wars about? They're about how best to raise kids, right? And if you want to know why millennials think they're so special, it's because as long as they can remember, the only thing of interest that older people argue about is how ideally and best they should be raised. So as we see this new generation, and I want to say that when we began to see its behavior, we saw some huge changes, some of them very positive, I must say, in how they're behaving. One I want to point out very quickly, and that is huge decline in personal risk-taking. And since the media doesn't talk about that, I will, because the media, you know, if it bleeds, it leads, but I can talk about it. Okay. Take a look at this. And this is really the most astounding figure I think you'll ever see. This is the gold standard of looking at crime rates, particularly youth crime. This is the victimization survey. Arrest records show the same thing, but they're not as accurate. This is actually a huge, 20,000 person survey every year. What you see is the crime, which is already pretty high because boomers had picked it up by 1973, peaks with late wave Xers. You know, most people who commit crime are between 15 and 30, right? So you know what you're seeing here. But it peaks with late wave Xers in the early to mid 1990s. And look at what it's done since. That scale goes all the way to 0. That is a 75% decline in serious youth crime. This is probably the most dramatic decline in youth violence in American history. And people are noticing it. One thing you notice, obviously there are urban areas now that you can walk around freely that you couldn't 20 years ago. But I find this to be astounding. But it's not just crime, it's youth taking across the board. The CDC actually runs a youth risk surveillance survey. They monitor about 150 different indicators, everything from buckling your seatbelt, driving while drunk, taking a weapon to school, sex in high school. All of these things, almost all of these things are decisively down since the mid-1990s. Take a look at this. The two most dangerous lifelong forms of substance abuse, alcohol and tobacco, are at the lowest rates ever today in grades 8, 10, and 12. And by the way, if I show this chart to a millennial classroom, they look at it for a while and then they find it highly amusing because they'll say, well, there's mom way up there, you know? I'm just not making this up. This Duke University, they have an index of child well-being. They've seen the same. Everyone sees these shifts going on. We predicted we predicted these in our first book in 1991, and we think we were vindicated in predicting some of these changes. But one of the things I want to say here quickly is just a few emerging pure personality trends we see among millennials. First, obviously, as I mentioned, they're special. They're special in the eyes of the parents, the media, politicians, and they have to be treated that way. And this is a big issue, and I know Cam's probably going to talk a little bit about this, but you have to treat them as VIPs, you know, when they come into your workplace. And I'll tell you, the one thing that Xers and Boomers don't want to do is treat them as VIPs. The first thing a Boomer and Xer wants to say to these kids is, I don't think you're special at all. That may be therapeutic, but it won't work, okay? And instead, you have to be very creative. You have to say things like, I think you kids are all very special, and guess what? We expect special things from you. It's interesting how hard it is for a lot of Boomers and Xers to think how to leverage positive self-esteem in dealing with young people. But we see so many, measures of this. This is my favorite. I recently did a Google Ngram on kids are special, how often that phrase appeared in books and articles. 0 in the early 1970s. You got any Xers born in that year? I'm sorry, but no one thought you were special. But look at how that changed since. Okay, what else? They're sheltered. We've only had 2 or 3 huge moral panics over children in American history, in 4 centuries of American history. We have just lived through one of them, the last 20 years. Think of all the laws that we've passed. Think of all the laws named after millennial victims. Megan laws, Amber Alerts, Code Adams, all that kind of stuff. Well, this also, and now it's not just that we're protecting them, but millennials expect to be protected. They don't mind someone looking after them. Very different from Gen Xers. Gen Xers say, cash out my benefits, I don't want you looking out for me, and all that kind of stuff. Xers get it. You think I'm special? You want to protect me? Fine. Go ahead, do it. And of course, these are Gen X parents, right? Using the drop cams to look after their kids. They're positive. This is incredibly positive. Regardless of all the bad things happening in the economy, they're very positive in their outlook. Very unlike Boomers, who are transforming midlife in an increasingly downbeat. Boomers have always been more downbeat than people of other age brackets. Even when they were adolescents, they were downbeat. But we see that in many surveys showing now. They're team playing. And they were raised by their parents to be team players, team teaching, team grading, community service, service learning. And we see so many aspects of that. We see it, for instance, in the rise in community service. We also see it in the rise, of course, of how they use digital technology, right? Boomers took digital technology away from the mainframe toward the personal computer. They individualized digital technology. Millennials are taking it back to the community, back to social media. And we're going to say they're addicted to social, but they're not addicted to social media. They're addicted to each other, and social media is the way in which they're brought together. And finally, they're conventional. You ask them how they want to, as they grow older, what they want to be. They want to be good citizens, good neighbors. Their favorite way to spend their time is with their parents, believe it or not. And the figures here are amazing. A record share of teens report no problems with any other family member, and as I said before, that closing of the culture gap. Boomers and their first wave millennial kids syncing their iPods, watching the same movies, buying the same brand name clothing, talking about their personal lives, and this is even coming into the workplace now. I predicted this 5 or 6 years ago. I said, parents are hovering over these kids in everything they do. It's K through 12, then it's college, then it's the military, and now they're in the civilian workplace. I predicted that people are going to invent a bring your parent to work week. And everyone laughed at me, but now this last summer, LinkedIn, Google, all these companies are beginning to introduce it. As soon as you talk to a millennial and you leave their office or you leave their particular desk, they're on the cell phone with their parents anyway. So you might as well just bring the parents into the loop. You might as well just talk to them together. Okay. We see this huge shift toward multi-generational living, which is a big reality for millennials. And finally, just a few trends quickly. We're going to see continued end of risk seeking as they redefine young adulthood. Less emphasis on cars. This is a huge crisis for the auto industry. Independence and risk-taking no longer appeals to kids. We're going to see stock prices too volatile. They don't want to invest in stocks. They don't want to invest in real estate. They're avoiding credit cards. They don't want to be in default of them. The rate of the new business starts for people under age 30 is now hitting record lows. It's considered too risky by kids. Rising social trust, ties to community. The rise of the sharing economy, which I don't have time to, but we could go into that. And enormously, this generation, they don't have to keep up with the Joneses. They can just hang out with the Joneses. You know what I mean? Just find someone with a lot of money and just be a nice friend, you know? And you can see the huge change in political views of this generation. This generation is voting for the party of community, without question. The new nice, the blanding of the culture, which the most striking recent example is Jimmy Fallon taking over the late night show, which boomers and Xers are sitting there saying, where's the snark? Where's the sarcasm? What's funny here? And millennials love it. And so you've seen, though, an 8-year decline in the median age of the viewers of the Late Show. How about this for employer branding? When I was age 25, I never would have applied to work at a company that had employer branding like that. I can tell you that. But millennials love it. What's the matter? It makes you happy, doesn't it? Okay. Achievement orientation, and we're seeing the rise of body apps and the way you keep your finances. Everything is done with monitoring constantly, second by second, your achievement and telling you how you're doing. And finally, a rising focus on structure and planning. And we see this is one thing they crave most in their workplace. I'm sure Cam's going to mention this. You see how much they want feedback. We've taken lots of surveys of the workplace. We see this repeatedly. And it's the one thing boomers don't need or don't want. And finally, how much this generation is trying to look far into the future. The idea of long-term planning is important to me. Millennials are equally as likely to say that as older generations, amazingly. And in this survey, we asked Gen X and boomers, when you were in your 20s, how important was the idea of long-term planning? Gen Xers, only 48% said that was important to them in their 20s. Boomers, 39%. And I remember a lot of those boomers in their 20s. And I would say it would be more like 4%, in my memory. Let me make my last point. And this is the point about rhythm of history. We think these generations, these different generational types, do not arise at random. We think that there's a long-term pattern, which we've seen throughout American history. Certain kinds of generations follow other types. For example, what we call the hero archetype comes of age at a time of national and social emergency, and they become politically powerful for the rest of their lives. And in their old age, as senior leaders, they're greeted by the next awakening era, the next awakening in religion and the culture fired by the young. It's happened in every case with that archetype. The prophet archetype, like boomers, is born just after the crisis. They come of age of the awakening, and in their old age, they preside over the next outer world crisis. We've seen this happen again and again, and we've also seen generations, some of them are the children of outer world crisis, like a war or a depression, and some are the children of the awakenings. And we've seen this pattern so repeatedly that we called attention to it, both in our book, Generations, as well as in our book, Fourth Turning. In the Fourth Turning, we suggested that history itself moves in generation-long intervals between post-war eras, like the recent American high. Community was important, individualism was suppressed, the nation felt a great sense of progress about where it was going. Any reaching out to minorities or people who were at all different was suppressed. What Vernon Parrington calls these the great barbecues of American history. You look at the awakenings. Many people call the late 60s and 70s America's fourth or fifth Great Awakening, depending on when you start your count in the 17th century or the 18th century. But always it involves attacking established institutions and completely reshaping the inner world of values, culture, religion, art. Awakenings are always followed by unravelings, which in many ways are the opposite of a high. This is a time when individualism is supreme, civic life is suppressed and weak. And these, of course, we think of the decades of the 1990s, the 1920s, the 1850s. These are all decades of cynicism and bad manners. And history shows that these unravelings are always followed by the fourth turnings. And these are the, and it's come on schedule. We think that when America entered a fourth turning in 2008, we think we're entering it both, obviously, in our economy. We're going to enter it shortly in our political institutions. And ultimately, it's going to have foreign policy implications as well. But these are the big turning points of American history. And we do not escape these rhythms. We live within them. They all have to do with each generation compensating for the excesses of each other. And they each have to do with the fact that some generations reshape the inner world of culture, art, religion. Other generations excel at reshaping the outer world of empire, politics, and the economy. And we think that that's a rhythm that will continue to course on as we move forward. And I'm not going to go over these. These are just some of the differences we see in the economy, what's out and what's in. And obviously, looks a little bit more like the 30s, right, where we've been over the last few years. These are some of the changes we see in society. Particularly take importance in seeing how we're moving towards stronger families, lower migration, falling fertility, and the importance of the new localism in community today. And finally, shifts in geopolitics that we're going to see. I use this economic patriotism, because that was actually Obama's a phrase that he used, one of his pitches that he used in the 2012 presidential election. This is a different world we're moving into. We've seen earlier decades like that, but not recently. And I think one last message I will say when it comes to generations, and particularly when it comes to looking at today's kids, we wonder, will the millennials end up, in the end, reshaping or having a beneficial impact on America as, say, the GI generation reshaped the 20th century in its own time? And I will leave you with that thought and leave you with perhaps a slightly more expanded way of thinking about the role of generations in history. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.